Thank you all for being here. Tonight, we're pleased to be hosting Oxford University's mathematician, Professor John Lennox, and acclaimed journalist, Christopher Hitchens, in what I'm sure will be a memorable evening for all of us. Of course, as most of you know, this event was originally slotted to be between author and political observer Dinesh D'Souza and Mr. Hitchens. But due to a major family surgery in India yesterday, Mr. D'Souza could not join us. Professor Lennox, however, was planning to be in the very seats that you now occupy, and so when we discovered that, we asked him if he was willing to participate rather than spectate, and he has graciously agreed. It was very providential. Or, if you prefer Mr. Hitchens' perspective, it was almost providential. Almost. I had to get that in there, Mr. Hitchens. I'm going to get a lot of mileage out of that. We also thank Fixed Point Foundation for loaning Professor Lennox to us this evening and helping us promote the event, since he actually was in town for a Fixed Point function. Now, with the help of more people that can be named, Dr. Andy Westmoreland, Dr. Brad Creed, University Relations Department, student involvement, university fellows, many volunteers, and our own tireless group of officers, just to name a few, we are now pleased to be hosting a very high-profile event on a very important topic. Indeed, what topic could be more important? And this is the Socratic Club's entire purpose, to thoughtfully engage and explore life's so-called great questions. I will state publicly that the Socratic Club is a Christian organization, modeled after the Oxford organization of the 1940s and 50s, which C.S. Lewis presided over. But just because we have an opinion on these issues does not mean that we are incapable of objectivity. If an idea cannot properly take its stand in the marketplace of ideas without collapsing, if it cannot survive without constantly being guarded from outside attacks, then it is not worth believing in the first place. We, however, think that Christianity can take its stand, and it is with such confidence that we invite thoughtful opposition, such as Mr. Hitchens, to engage us in what we hope will be a very fruitful dialogue. C.S. Lewis once noted, in any fairly large and talkative community, such as a university, there is always the danger that those who think alike should gravitate together into coteries, where they will henceforth encounter the opposition only in the emasculated form of rumor, and that the outsiders say thus and thus. The absent are easily refuted, complacent dogmatism thrives, and differences of opinion are embittered by group hostility. Each group hears not the best, but the worst that the other groups can say. Christian though he was, I think that this is a sentiment which any thoughtful person can agree with, and it is exactly the problem we are trying to combat. We want to bring the best of both sides to bear. I think you will agree with me that we have done fairly well this evening. We have not put the worst of each side out here, but rather some of the best minds that each has to offer. It is with this in mind that we hope you will listen carefully and respectfully to what each man has to say this evening. Finally, before I turn over the floor, I would like to remind you that filming and flash photography are prohibited. Fixed Point Foundation is filming the event, and if you would like to get footage of the event, you may contact them afterwards or on their website. I will now turn over the floor to this evening's moderator, Dr. Christopher Metras. Dr. Metras is a professor of English here at Samford, the director of the recently founded University Fellows Program, and recent winner of the Macon Teaching Award, of which he was very deserving, if I may say so. He is also the faculty sponsor of the Socratic Club and something of a mentor to myself personally. If my classes have been any indicator at all, I think that I can say he has the gift of moderating in the Socratic style, which happens to be very fitting for his role this evening. And it is with that that I turn the floor over to Dr. Chris Metras.
I'll try to get us going. Thank you very much, Michael. And on behalf of the Samford faculty, administration, and staff, I welcome everybody to campus this evening. Now, before we begin the actual debate, I want to briefly and very briefly introduce our two speakers and then go over the ground rules for this evening. Now, our first participant, sitting immediately to my left, is Mr. Christopher Hitchens. Mr. Hitchens is a journalist, a literary critic, and a political commentator who is one of the most widely recognized public intellectuals of our day. And although he's the author of 17 books, he is perhaps best known for his most recent book, God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything, an international bestseller that, among other things, mounts a vigorous challenge to religious faith and its role in contemporary global society. An independent thinker who resists classification, he has carved out a unique place for himself in America's current political and social landscape. Please join me in welcoming to Birmingham Mr. Christopher Hitchens. Our second participant this evening is Professor John Lennox. Dr. Lennox is Professor of Mathematics at Oxford University and Fellow in Mathematics and the Philosophy of Science at Green Templeton College, Oxford. Early in his career, as senior scholar at Emmanuel College, Cambridge, Professor Lennox attended the last lectures of C.S. Lewis, and since that time, he has emerged as a Christian apologist in his own right. Although his speaking engagements have taken him all over the world, he is perhaps best known to Birmingham audiences for his role in the God delusion debate at UAB back in the fall of 2007. At this event, Dr. Lennox debated fellow Oxford professor and leading Darwinist Richard Dawkins on the existence of God, a debate that not only surprised many in the international academic community for its spirited collegiality, but also helped to set an example for the possibilities of cordial but productive debate across ideological lines. Please join me in welcoming back to Birmingham, Dr. John Lennox. Now, I know we're all ready to go, but I do need to say a few words about the format tonight. It's outlined a little bit in your program. We'll begin with opening remarks. Each speaker will be allotted 15 minutes uninterrupted to offer these opening remarks. As the speaker nears the end of his allotted time, I will signal him with the statement 1 minute remaining. Near the end of that minute, I will signal again 30 seconds remaining. And should the speaker continue on, I will be put in the unenviable position of having to cut him off and turn the floor over to his opponent. The same will happen at the 10-minute time allotted for rebuttal. Again, as we near the time, I will tell the speakers of 1 minute to go. Then I'll remind them of 30 seconds to go. And then I will once again, if they keep going, be put in the unenviable position of having to cut one of our speakers off. I spoke to both of the gentlemen backstage. I told them how much I dislike being unenvied. So they have assured me that they will stay and act like perfect gentlemen and stay within their allotted time. Now, the rebuttal period will be followed by questions from the audience. But we're going to do this a bit different than you might have done in another kind of discussion like this. We do not have microphones where you can queue up. Instead, we handed note cards to you this evening when you entered. If at any time during the discussion between the opening comments or the allotted time for rebuttal, you have a question, please write that question down on that index card. During the break between speakers, say when Mr. Hitchens has finished his 15-minute opening remarks, if you wish, pass your question to your right. And we have volunteers who will pick up those questions in the aisle between segments. Those questions will be put in order for me, and then I will take those questions and ask them of our two guests this evening. So, without any further delay, let's begin our debate, and Mr. Hitchens has the honor of opening first.
Thank you, sir.
Well, let me begin by thanking all of you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming, by thanking you, Christopher, for that suspiciously terse, grudging introduction, and by confessing that I'll have difficulty when I get back to the North, persuading my smart friends in New York that there's a Socratic society in Birmingham, Alabama at all. I mean, I told my publishers when I started, I want to begin in Dixie. I don't want to do the usual book tour. I want to take the campaign through the South. And they said, but why would you want to do that? I mean, who doesn't know that it's one long white sheet toga party? Crosses crackling merrily on the lawn in the night breeze. Later on, they repair to an illegal still or hooch to reflect gloatingly on their multiple offenses against chastity, particular emphasis on the loss of virginity with domestic or even semi-wild animals. So it's always a pleasure for me to go back to the the liberal consensus and say to them, you know, you'd be surprised by how quite a lot of that isn't really true. I stick up for you guys when I can, I really do. Now, I'm guessing that tonight I'm not speaking to a largely or predominantly Muslim or Jewish audience. If I was, believe me, I would try and find a way of unsettling you. I'm guessing that those of you who are believers are probably of the Christian kind. As you know, the atheist position is the following, that of the many hundreds, if not thousands, of gods and religions that humanity has invented in its time, we have three, roughly, and only three, not roughly, only three alternatives in considering them. One is that all of them are true. One is that all of them are false, and the other is that only one of them is true. The first proposition is self-evidently absurd. They can't conceivably all be true. Indeed, there are mutually exclusive forms of Christianity, just to take only one religion. That all are false seems at least possible. That only one is true is the position, say, of my opponent, Dr. Lennox, I think must be the hardest single position to take. But in the spirit of it, I'll assume Christianity, and I'll just remind you of a novel that probably most of you won't have heard of, but was once very famous. It was called When It Was Dark. Has anyone heard of it or read it? It was a huge bestseller just before the First World War. It was by a man called Guy Thorne. And the mise en scène of the novel is this, that news comes from Palestine that a grave has been opened, and that in this grave, the stone rolled away from the tomb. On a stone inside is the body of a man who's been scourged, crucified, had a crown of thorns pressed down on his head, has a terrible wound in his side, an almost perfectly preserved cadaver. And on the news of this terrible archaeological discovery, the world undergoes a complete moral collapse. Because without the resurrection, or with definite proof that there was no such thing, that the resurrection was a fabrication, there's no further moral restraint on humanity. People are coupling like beasts in the streets. They give themselves up to plunder and theft and rape and murder and perjury without conscience. A midnight of civilization falls upon an unhappy world until it's finally discovered that the whole thing was a fabrication put around by sinister Jewish people and journalists and other untrustworthy riffraff as a stunt, and then people can go back to being moral again. Well, you see where, or perhaps you can guess where I might be headed with this. In my view, if every one of the gods that have been discredited, instead of only the two or three left to us that haven't yet been completely shown up as man-made fabrications and joined Thor and Ashtaroth and Huitzilopochtli and the Aztecs and all the others, if all of these were proven to be fraudulent and false and man-made, I believe our moral dilemmas would be exactly the ones we face now. All of us, atheist, agnostic, philosophical, Socratic, or true believer. We would still have to wonder about the purpose of our existence here. We would still have to wonder about the origins of the cosmos and of nature. We would still have to wonder about our duties to one another. We would still have to wonder about how to build the just city, how to reflect on truth and on beauty. All of these dilemmas would remain exactly the way they are. They're unaltered by any supernatural dimension. And our subject tonight is the supernatural dimension itself, the chieftain of that dimension, the concept of God. So I want to begin by clarifying why it is that I believe there is no such entity or person, and I want to go on to say why I'm relieved when I reflect that this is so, why I think it would be horrible if it were true or otherwise. And I think I'd have to begin with a distinction between theism and deism. Even Thomas Aquinas' famous 5 proofs of the existence of God, for example, are, strictly speaking, hardly theological at all. They're essentially only deistic. They are about first causes, or uncaused potential, or latent causes. They derive the idea of a creator from various gaps and from observation of the rhythms and the patterns of nature and the cosmos. And they postulate that these rhythms and patterns would make no sense without a first cause. In short, they postulate nothing more than the argument from design, which, as you all know, is subject to a refutation that says, well, if there was a designer, then the designer must himself have been designed, and threatens those who offer the case with an infinite regression into a chaos. However, I would say it's not possible to refute this argument conclusively or utterly or finally. Only one can point out, as I will, some gross absurdities and inconsistencies in it. But for this evening, and for the purposes of tonight, why don't I simply grant that it could be true, that there was an original creator, and that that's a good and elegant explanation for how at least the cosmos and the process of life on Earth, two quite different things, got started. Why don't I just grant the deist his point? After all, in the time that I've written the most about, at the time of Thomas Jefferson and the time of Thomas Paine, both of those gentlemen deists, an intelligent person would probably have had no choice but to believe something very like that. There's no superstition to it. There's nothing supernatural about it. But it leaves the theist, like my learned opponent, with all, if I make this concession, it leaves him with all his work still to come. He still has to show, somehow, not only that there is a God, but that he himself understands the mind of that God, knows the will, or can interpret the will and wishes of that deity on such weighty questions as what is good, what is evil, what foods may be requisite, or what foods may be profane, what sexual partnerships are allowed, what sexual positions indeed are licit or legitimate, what days of the week are holy or otherwise, whether it is requisite to mutilate the genitals of children. Major questions where someone has to say, yes, I know we must do this because I happen to know what God wants us to do. Now, it's my submission, ladies and gentlemen, and I think it's a fairly modest one, that brilliant as a mathematician Dr. Lennox may be, no person, no other human being, no other primate, no fellow mammal of mine, however clever they may be, is in any position to say that they know God's will, or God's word, or God's desire or intention. This information is not accessible to human beings, and therefore my first statement is this: those who do claim that they know are already, in a sense, discredited. They're deluded, and in a sense, they're the first ones who have to concede that the argument goes on without them, because we have to be awed, all of us, more and more, all the time, more and more awed at that, as we discover how much more there is to know by how little of it we do know or can know. It's only those who say that they know they are certain who we have to distrust, a priori, if I can use that expression. Very well, hoping I've established that point, just for the sake of the debate. We don't have a word adeist, though I think we should. I would say I was an adeist as well as an atheist. I don't believe there was a prime mover. I don't believe there was a first cause of a divine kind. I think we have better and further and brighter explanations for the origins of things than the idea of a supernatural first cause. But some also would say we don't even really need the word atheist, because after all, I don't require a special term. When I tell you I don't believe in a tooth fairy, you don't say, well, what's the word for someone who doesn't do that? When I say I don't believe in witches, and I don't believe in the biblical injunction to kill them either, they don't say, what is it to be a non-believer in witches and witchcraft? When I say to a Muslim, your prophet believes in dust devils and jinns and the haunting spirits of the desert, shows what nonsensical peasant superstition is involved in the Muslim profession of faith. No one says to me, what word are you using to say you don't believe in dust devils and jinns? I think I can be generally credited with having good reasons for my doubt. However, I think that the challenge is a fair one, because I think we are divided as between those of us who attribute our presence here to the laws of biology and the laws of physics, and those of us who, and we are modest in doing that, I think, we say we submit ourselves to the evidence, and even if it comes up with conclusions that aren't very welcome to us, we will accept them if they're well-founded, and those who are conceited enough, I would say, arrogant enough, in fact, to think that they are here as the consequence of a divine design. There's all the difference in the world between those two worldviews, and the big difference is one of them has evidence for it and the other doesn't. And one of them will say in advance what would refute it. I can tell you, if you ask me, what evidence, if presented, would mean I'd have to change my mind, and the theist will never do that. He will never tell you in advance, show me this and I'll stop believing in it. There's always an infinite replenishment of the infinitely renewable resource of faith going on. In fact, it's the humility of it that makes me laugh at it in a way the most. They say that they're humble, these believers in God. They want to be written up as modest because they think that, of course, that God tells them they're worms, originally sinful, ingrates, incurable, made out of dust in one narrative, out of a clot of blood in the Quranic narrative, bad, off to a pretty shaky start, condemned since an original fall of man. Nonetheless, cheer up. The universe is designed with you in mind. This is a depraved form of sadomasochism in my view. It's not good for you to go from this terrible abjection and serfdom in the one instance to this belief that you are the center of creation and the object of the cosmos in the other. It's a terrible alternation, a neurotic alternation between being much too servile and much too arrogant. But just locally, what would it be to believe this? Suppose you did believe that everything that had brought us here was by design. Well, we know that 99.9% of all species that have ever existed just on this planet have become extinct. So heaven has already watched almost 100% of its creation die off, often in very unpleasant, callous circumstances, with folded arms, right? And that's billions of years of geological time. Some people say the Homo sapiens has been around for 100,000 years, some for as long as 250,000. No one says less than 100,000. Francis Collins, the great Christian believer who did the Human Genome Project, says certainly 100,000. I'll take 100. Richard Dawkins thinks it's more. I'll take 100. What does it mean if we're divinely supervised and divinely created and looked out for? It means that for 98 or so thousand of those years, humans, Homo sapiens, were being born, dying, half of them in childbirth, I would think. Life expectancy maybe of 20 years, maybe of 30, people dying essentially of their teeth and of hideous diseases, living in permanent fear. Where are the earthquakes coming from? Where are the lightning strikes coming from? Why is all this? What are these diseases that hit us? We don't know about microbes, we have no idea. That's to say nothing about the fights with neighboring tribes over women, over land, over meat, over subsistence, the torture, the violence, the cruelty that goes on. I don't need to underline all of it, I hope. You can picture it for yourself. 98,000, the first 98,000 years, heaven watches this going on with perfect insouciance. And something like 2,000 to 3,000 years ago decides, right, we have to intervene now. We have to do something about this. Well, what would be the best way of intervening to try and redeem this rather bleak picture? What about having somebody tortured to death in an obscure part of the Middle East? That ought to cure it. Or if you're a Muslim, what about getting an illiterate epileptic shepherd to start babbling and saying that he's been talking to an archangel? Or what about inventing the figure of Moses in a mountain that's never yet been found by any geographer, Mount Sinai? That's what you'd have to believe. I've got a minute, right? That's what you'd have to believe, and that's why I ask myself, why do the worshippers of this God want to convict him of being such a crummy designer? Most of his creations die off, and the rest suffer miserably, and the redemptive offers just don't somehow take, of being cruel and capricious and bungling and incompetent. Why, and callous as a father. And so, since this is as far as I can get now, I have to tell you why I don't think the idea of an eternal father is a good one in any case when I next get the chance to draw breath. But thank you for staying with me this far.
please.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for coming. It's a great pleasure for me to be back again in this university, and I'm delighted to once more meet Christopher Hitchens. It's a delight to meet an Englishman who's an American citizen on his own territory. I agree very much with Christopher Hitchens in his repudiation of many of the evils that he claims have been done in the name of God. But I've learned to distinguish between the greatness of God and the inexcusable evil that has been done by those professing his name. And so I do not deduce that God is not great and that religion poisons everything. After all, if I fail to distinguish between the genius of Einstein and the abuse of his science to create weapons of mass destruction, I might be tempted to say science is not great and technology poisons everything. What is more, as I look back at the evils of atheist regimes of the 20th century, I might also be tempted, ladies and gentlemen, to say atheism is not great. It has poisoned everything. As it is, I hold that science shows some of the greatness of God. The famous physicist James Clerk Maxwell, who discovered electromagnetic theory, inscribed above the door in his laboratory in Cambridge University the words, "Great are the works of the Lord, studied by all who delight in them." Yet Christopher Hitchens says, thanks to the telescope and the microscope, religion no longer offers an explanation of anything. I find it impossible as a scientist to take such a statement seriously, as if using a microscope and a Rembrandt painting could disprove the existence of Rembrandt himself. The idea that God and science are mutually exclusive explanations of the universe is as wrong as saying that internal combustion and Henry Ford are mutually exclusive explanations of the automobile. They are complementary explanations. One explains how it works, the other why it exists. To think that as the reach of our instruments increases, the greatness of God the Creator somehow diminished is to make the mistake of confusing mechanism with agency. When Newton discovered the law of gravity, he didn't say, now I know how the universe works, I don't need God. No, his wonder at how it was done increased his admiration for the Creator who'd done it that way. And Newton wrote the most famous scientific treatise of all time, the Principia Mathematica, in the hope that it would persuade the thinking man to believe in a deity. Telescopes can show us the wonder of the night sky, but science didn't put the stars there, nor did the laws of biology and physics, ladies and gentlemen. They describe what is there, they don't put it there. Stephen Hawking says the usual approach of science of constructing a mathematical model cannot answer the question why there should be a universe for the model to describe. He then asks, why does the universe go to all the bother of existing? Does it need a creator? Yes, it does need a creator. Alan Sandage, widely regarded as one of the fathers of modern astronomy, who discovered quasars, said, I find it quite improbable that such order came out of chaos. There has to be some organizing principle. God to me is a mystery, but is the explanation for the miracle of existence, why there is something rather than nothing. And another giant of cosmology, Arno Penzias, won his Nobel Prize for discovering an echo of the Big Bang. But Penzias could see how unimaginably greater is the God who conceived of this beginning to space-time in the first place. Astronomy, he says, leads us to a unique event, a universe which was created out of nothing, one with a very delicate balance needed to provide exactly the right conditions required to permit life, and one which has an underlying, one might say, supernatural plan. Einstein had the brilliant insight that the speed of light was an absolute constant. But what shall we say of the creative mind that said, "Let there be light," and there was light? To measure the speed of light is one thing, to create light is another. Far from science showing God is not great, as Christopher Hitchens suggests, the very opposite is the case. It was belief in God that motivated the advance of science in the 16th and 17th centuries. Galileo, Copernicus, Kepler, Newton expected to find law in nature because they believed in a great lawgiver. Now, so often we hear the new atheists talk about faith and deprecating it. But I want to tell you that scientists are all people of faith, as Einstein saw. They believe that the universe is accessible to the human mind. And physics cannot explain that for the simple reason that you can't do physics without believing that the universe is intelligible. So scientists required faith, and yet I read Christopher Hitchens saying, if one must have faith to believe in something, then the likelihood of that something having truth or value is considerably diminished. Pardon? Well, one must have faith that the universe is intelligible to do science. So I am to deduce, am I, that the likelihood of science having truth or value is considerably diminished? Exit science then. And I presume that Christopher Hitchens, like most of the rest of us, believes in his own existence. Yes, am I to take it then that the likelihood he really does exist is considerably diminished? His statement is a self-refuting statement. And I find it ironical that the so-called new atheists are so passionate about ridding the world of faith that they appear to be blind to the fact that they themselves are driven by faith. They believe that their minds can grasp truth. They believe in science. They believe that God is not great. Yet Mr. Hitchens informs us in a classic oxymoron, our principles are not a faith. Our beliefs are not a belief. The mind boggles, ladies and gentlemen. That is not the only irony, for the new atheists offer no ground for the faith that they themselves cannot do without. After all, if human life has been cobbled together by mindless, unguided processes, why should we trust our cognitive faculties and the validity of any belief that they produce, atheism and science included? John Gray gets it exactly right. Modern humanism is the faith that through science humankind can know the truth and so be free. But if Darwin's theory of natural selection is true, this is impossible. The human mind serves evolutionary success, not truth. Well, this reduces all rationality to zero. And far from atheism being great, it seems to me that it is irrational, anti-scientific, and incoherent, even though emotionally its proponents seem unable to take this on board. Now, as the early pioneers of science saw, the rational justification of science is provided by the existence of the Creator, who created not only the universe, but the human mind that studies it. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. All things were made by Him. That makes perfect sense to me as a mathematician. Science is important, but it has its limitations. It cannot answer the questions of a child. What are we here for? What is the meaning of life? Nor can it tell us whether literature or art is good or bad. Hence, an atheism that insists that science is the only way to truth diminishes human beings. This is very obvious to many of my Russian friends. We thought we could abolish God and retain a value for human beings, but we found we couldn't. Do away with the greatness of God, ladies and gentlemen, and you can do away with the nobility of human beings endowed with all the potential of hearts and minds made in God's image. You also do away with their freedom. You are left with a mindless, unguided process that somehow threw humans up at its endless lottery to exist without ultimate hope for a tiny moment, only to be crushed by the same blind forces that produced them. Some freedom that. Another evidence of the greatness of God consists in the ordinary freedoms that we often take for granted. Here's an influential German atheist thinker, Jürgen Habermas, and he says this: Christianity and nothing else is the ultimate foundation of liberty, conscience, human rights, and democracy, the benchmarks of Western civilization. To this day, we have no other option. We continue to nourish ourselves from this source. Everything else is postmodern chatter. It was Christianity, not atheism, incidentally, that originally gave us the universities that educated the new atheists, gave them the liberty that permits them to propagate their views, and the law that protects them as well as the rest of us. And yet Christopher Hitchens insists that the God he does not believe in is a tyrant and a bully, as we just heard. I don't actually believe in such a God either. It is so alien to my own knowledge and experience. But I might point out as an aside that atheism is no solution to tyranny either, as the bloodbath of the 20th century shows only too well. But there's another deep problem here. To say that God is not great is a moral statement. To say he's tyrannical is a moral statement, and that must be based on some moral standard. Otherwise, you couldn't distinguish evil from its opposite. But if there is no eternal base for values external to humanity, how can Mr. Hitchens or anyone else's standards be anything but limited human conventions, ultimately meaningless products of a blind, unguided evolutionary process? How can random mutations and blind selection produce any morality at all, let alone the kind of apparently invincible morality that justifies the new atheist intolerance of religion? John Gray points out that the new atheists defend liberal freedoms without asking where they come from. Hard atheists like Nietzsche, Camus, and Sartre will want to know how atheists can rationally justify their absolute sounding commitment to timeless values without implicitly invoking God. They would say you cannot. And Richard Dawkins gets close to hard atheism when he says that in a universe of blind physical forces, you won't find any reason or rhyme nor any justice. The universe has the properties that we should expect if there is no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. But if Hitler or Paul or you and I are simply dancing to our DNA, no one can blame us for anything. All morality is gone. So the claim that God is not great, being a moral claim, dissolves into utter meaninglessness. And here we meet a strange contradiction. That the atheism seems to me, ironically, to deny the one thing that upholds moral values, that is justice. For millions, ladies and gentlemen, there is no justice in this life. And according to atheism, they will never get it after death, since death's the end. So the terrorists who dance to their DNA on the bodies of their victims get away with it. They will not get away with it, ladies and gentlemen. Because here is another aspect of the greatness of God, that he is the ultimate judge of mankind. There is to be a judgment at which justice will be done fairly. In England at the moment, atheists have paid for an advertising campaign where buses carry a message: there's probably no God, so stop worrying and enjoy your life. Why is it that atheists associate God with worry? Is that they fear to meet him as judge? They don't like judgment, but I can't help noticing sometimes how judgmental they are. German Marxist thinker Max Horkheimer said a very interesting thing. He feared there might not be a God, since then there would be no judgment and no justice. And here we have a dilemma. The problem of my human guilt on the one hand and my desire for justice on the other. I want justice, but what will justice say to me? And what about God? Is he really the despot they make him out to be? No, there's yet more to his greatness. God is not only the great creator and judge, he's a God of grace and love. And the central claim of Christianity is this: that as an expression of his love, God himself became human. The Word became flesh. Christ shows us as none other the greatness of God. He made unique claims to be the truth, to be the Son of God, and backed them up by a life and teaching without parallel. but his moral teaching was not his main message. His stated mission was to deal with the moral chasm that separates us humans from God by taking our sins on himself. Ladies and gentlemen, we scientists cannot even tell you what energy is. So don't be surprised if I cannot completely explain to you the deepest mystery of our universe's history, the death and resurrection of Jesus. Yet just as we see the effect of and use energy without completely understanding it, what I do observe is the transformation, the peace, the hope that comes into the lives of ordinary men and women who learn to place their faith, their confidence, their trust in Christ as Savior and God. I see in them and experience in myself a transcendent sense of purpose that atheism does not have, and a hope that atheism does not know. It is here, ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you, that the greatness of God is supremely manifest. Thank you.